Alrighty. So let's give this a few seconds. Let the folks file in. Well, here we go. Hello. Welcome, folks. Come on in. We're going to give it a few seconds just to let the room fill a little bit. So go ahead and grab your beverage of choice, get comfortable, pull up a coat or blanket or, maybe a cold beverage today since it's so nice out. So hello, everyone. Welcome to our little virtual event space. My name is Allie, and I will be the host for the evening. And I am so excited to be introducing Kerry and Linda Killinger here to discuss their new book, Nothing is Too Big to Fail. So before we get into the fun stuff, I just want to quickly thank you so much for tuning in and for buying books. Of course, your guys' support really is what keeps this place going, and we really love what we do. So if you also love what we do, we would so appreciate it if you swing by, grab some copies, or if you're not local, we do ship. Shipping is just $3.50 for the first book and $1 for every book after that. And you get to support USPS too, which is like a little added bonus. I will be linking books in the chat all night, so they should be easy to find. And while you are over on our website, I definitely recommend checking out some of our other upcoming events. Sign up for our newsletter. It's just a weekly update about events, exciting releases, book clubs, etc. And of course, follow us on any of the major social media platforms. We are at the Third Place Books for the quickest updates and recommendations. And we have a pretty good time over there on social media, so definitely go and see what that's about. See if there's anything over there for you. So we are here for about an hour. And towards the end, we will be taking questions. So if you have any questions, which I very much hope that you do, go ahead and leave those in the Q&A box, which is different than the chat box. The chat box is great for virtual applause and connecting with each other. But once it comes time for questions, definitely throw those in the Q&A so that we can find them a little bit easier. And those will be either at the top or at the bottom of your screen. And I believe that is all of my housekeeping. So without further ado, I am so thrilled to introduce Kerry Killinger, who was the former chairman, president, and CEO of Washington Mutual Bank, the sixth largest depository bank in the country, prior to the financial crisis of 2008, a role for which he received the 2001 Banker of the Year title by American Banker and was elected to the American Society of Corporate Executives. Following the 2008 recession, Kerry founded Crescent Capital and currently serves as its CEO. Linda Killinger is the CEO of Olympic Consulting Partners. Previously, she worked as the vice chair of the Federal Home Loan Bank of Des Moines, the director of administration for the Iowa Department of Human Services, and the chair of former governor of Iowa, Tom Vilsack's Committee for Comprehensive Housing Strategy for Iowa. Their book, Too Big to Fail, goes behind the scenes of the 2008 recession to understand the failures of policy that led to those events and explores how, without focused action from the US government and leading organizations, we may be on track to repeat those same mistakes. So thank you all so much for being here. I am so excited to listen in on this conversation. If you need anything, give me a shout. That goes for the chat too. Scream if you need something. And at this point, I will leave you in their capable hands. Don't forget to throw your questions in the Q&A. And welcome, both of you.
Well, thank you very much,
Thank you, Allie.
We really appreciate the kind introduction and welcome everybody here joining us tonight. Again, I'm Kerry Killinger, it's my wife Linda, and we're really pleased to be able to share what we've been working on for quite some time with our book, Nothing is Too Big to Fail. And the reason that we've really focused on writing this was that to cover three things. I think first is to talk about the 2008 financial crisis and why it did not need to happen, and some of the mistakes that were made that helped make that happen. Second, we're going to give you some behind the scenes details that others have never known about what we believe was an inappropriate seizure of Washington Mutual, and particularly those of us in the Seattle area know what kind of a impact it had on the community when that was unfortunately taken away by the regulators. We're going to talk about some of the behind the scene things what happened there. And then third, we're going to talk about the risk we see growing today for the risk of a new financial crisis. And our hope is that by getting all the facts out on the table about some of the mistakes that were made back in the last financial crisis, that maybe our policy leaders will figure that out and not make the corrections today so that we don't have to repeat some of those issues. Now, Linda and I are going to kind of break our presentation down, and I'm going to begin by asking questions of Linda so that she can talk about a number of things and then we'll turn it back over and she'll ask me a few questions. And when we're done with that process, then we'll be happy to get into whatever questions you might have. I guess, Linda, I'll start off with asking you the questions. There's been some other books that have been written about the 2008 financial crisis. Why did you do this? Why'd you write this book, and what's kind of unique about our book?
Well, first of all, I want to thank everybody for being here. It's really nice to be with this group of people. And we had a couple of good things happen lately with the book. First of all, it was a #1 bestseller on Amazon this past week. And also last week, we received the Axiom Bronze Medal for one of the best business books of the year. So we're really excited that people are interested in the book, and evidently are reading it. But as far as why our book is different, there's been a lot of books written about the financial crisis, but they've been very little mention of Washington Mutual. And when there was mentioning of Washington Mutual, it was really with a lot of inaccurate information because they really didn't have the true story of what was going on behind the scenes. Kerry and I have spent the last 6-7 years. We've interviewed and talked with hundreds of people that have been impacted by the crisis. We have documents from Washington Mutual and other sources that people have not seen before or heard of before. So we have a better notion of what really happened behind the scenes. And our book is really fact-based and data-driven. I think one thing we've learned in the past few years is that facts matter. The truth matters. And so we've been able to put together something that really has the true facts about what happened behind the scenes.
Well, great. So, Linda, what are some examples of information that we've been able to put out in the book that maybe have been misunderstood or things that were just not right about what has been said before about the financial crisis?
Well, I think one thing that people don't know, because we've done some original research on this and secured a lot of data on who was doing subprime loans. And what we found is that 85% of all the subprime loans, and people haven't known this yet, this is new research that we've done, 85% of all the subprime loans that were originated between 2002 and 2007 were done by unregulated shadow banks. Banks you probably never heard of before, like Ameriquest, New Century, First Franklin. And they, between the period of 2002 and 2007, they did 85% of the loans, but that amounted to about $2 trillion of subprime loans. And those loans in the shadow system performed 2 or 3 times worse than the loans in the regulated banks. And so all the regulated banks had much better quality subprime and other lending products. What the unregulated banks like Ameriquest and New Century, what they would do is they would take their loans and feed them into basically an unregulated system, investment banks in Wall Street, investment banks in other companies in Wall Street, and put them into products like collateralized debt obligations, CDOs, that were also unregulated and pretty much unsupervised during this period. So people, a lot of the regulators and a lot of people in Washington, D.C. really didn't know or understand that all these trillions of dollars of subprime loans were being originated and produced almost overnight into this massive system that eventually ended up with $62 trillion worth of credit default swaps that were insuring all these CDOs. So it became quite a massive system that just collapsed on its own.
Mhm. So and we'll be digging into a lot more about the financial crisis in a minute when I kind of talk about what really was going on in housing and some of the risks that the policymakers led us towards and some of the problems there. I mentioned in the opening, we're going to have three themes. One is talking about that crisis. The second one was talking about Washington Mutual, why it was seized and we believe inappropriately seized. And then the third will be talking about the risks that we see coming up today. On that second point on Washington Mutual, your research indicated that you think it was not fairly treated. What did you find, and what was going on then?
Well, what happened leading up to the crisis, all the way up to September 2008, the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department and others and other regulators really didn't have a good grasp on what was happening behind the scenes and how serious the crisis was. Kerry served on the TIAC council in the Federal Reserve, and so he talked with the Federal Reserve every quarter. And starting in 2003, started warning them that there's this massive shadow system producing subprime loans out there, and the whole mortgage market was getting to be very fragile. But Kerry just didn't talk about it. He actually did something. So in 2003, Kerry saw a crisis coming and literally cut loan volume in half, all the loan volume in half, and then continued to cut the loans from 2003 to 2007 by 74%. So by about 2006 or so, all the major banks are making more mortgage loans than Washington Mutual. And what Kerry also did during that time period is replace, because there's a massive loss of sales because they weren't doing as many mortgage loans anymore. So what he did is he diversified the company by purchasing and promoting other products, more retail operations. He purchased a credit card company. They did more commercial lending. So he really managed to diversify the company substantially away from mortgage lending during that time period. But still, in those years running up to the crisis, they still produced record profits and revenue, even with the massive loss of not doing as much mortgage lending. But what happened was the regulators really weren't prepared for what was going to happen in September, and there was no game plan. So they really didn't know what to do. Like, for example, on September 6th, Treasury forced Fannie and Freddie into conservatorship. So all those shareholders lost their money. And then they turned around on September 12th, they let Lehman fail, which really caused massive panic in the market. And then on September 16th, they saved AIG Insurance by giving them $85 billion worth of loans to help them repay their counterparties to their insurance products that they had sold. And then on September 20th, the Goldman Sachs, it was apparent that Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, the two investment banks, were going under, that they just didn't have liquidity and they really couldn't go on much longer. So Treasury and the Federal Reserve turned them into bank holding companies, which gave them literally unlimited access to billions of dollars in lending. But then 2 or 3 days later, they inexplicably completely cut off liquidity to Washington Mutual. And not only that, but the Fdic really refused to pay the bondholders. And that caused even more panic in the market, which led to the fast sale of Wachovia. But you have to ask yourself, so why were Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley given billions and billions of dollars of liquidity when they were failing? But when Washington Mutual and Wachovia were losing deposits, they didn't give them access to any liquidity. So there really was a, what Treasury had said is they wanted to really move a lot of the banks into Wall Street. And so that was accomplished by moving Wachovia and Washington Mutual into Wall Street.
So it was a period of, I understand, a lot of stress going on in the regulators, but they had no game plan and treated everybody in a very inconsistent manner. And I think we coined a phrase we mentioned in the book, and we did in congressional testimony once, that Washington Mutual had a problem that it was not too clubby to fail, and that you basically had a club going on the East Coast, which had the regulators, the Treasury, the large Wall Street banks, and they took care of themselves and found a way to, in this case, merge Washington Mutual into one of the major East Coast banks. I think one of the unusual things about Washington Mutual too is that the examination ratings and the financial status was in relatively good shape. Can you comment about those a bit?
Yeah, there's a lot of misinformation about what shape Washington Mutual was in, and we, detail and document this information in our book. But before the crisis, the entire 20 years that Kerry was CEO of Washington Mutual, the bank was a high 2 rated bank, which means that's about as good as you can get. It's on a scale from 1 to 5, and 1 is kind of rare. So it was consistently a highly rated 2 bank. And going into the crisis, the summer of 2008, Washington Mutual was the highest capitalized bank in the country of the large banks. For example, the Tier 1 capital ratio for Washington Mutual in the summer of 2008 going into September was 10%, and the risk-adjusted capital ratio is 14%. And a lot of the big banks barely have that now. So Washington Mutual was well capitalized. Washington Mutual also had access to a line of credit with the Federal Home Loan Banks and other sources of liquidity of about $50 billion, which most experts were telling them that would be more than enough to survive through this crisis. So it was really also up to the crisis, the deposits after IndyMac in the summer, the failure of IndyMac, Washington Mutual and Wachovia lost about 6% of their deposits. But by August, Washington Mutual had quickly regained those deposits back up to about 145 billion in deposits. But after Lehman Brothers failed, they also had another deposit run that was just probably a little bit more than what they had in the summer, 8 or 9%. So it wasn't anything that they couldn't handle or take care of. And it was slowing down. The week before the seizure, they were starting to get the deposits back. So the deposits only went down to about, they still had $125 billion worth of deposits. So it was, in pretty good shape, we thought, and everybody, including the regulators, thought it was in good enough shape to survive, the big crisis that was going to probably happen.
Yeah. So I think just from a timing standpoint, I had left Washington Mutual at the beginning of September, and that was before the Lehman problem when the regulators let that fail. But when we left, we had, again, as Linda mentioned, we had the highest capital of any bank in the country, at least of the major banks. Everything I saw is that the loan losses were right targeted. They were going just fine. Yes, there was a housing downturn, but the performance was right in line with expectations, and they were actually improving. And also the liquidity of the bank was improving. It was in good shape because We had already recovered all the deposits from the IndyMac when they failed, and that caused people to get nervous. All those deposits had come back in, and we were in really good shape. So when I left in 1st of September, we thought things would be just fine. And we frankly read with the same shock that everyone else did, that about 3 weeks later that the regulators stepped in and seized the organization. And can you comment a little bit, why was it seized based on the research you've seen here?
Well, it was kind of a Bermuda Triangle event. On one part of the triangle was Hank Paulson, who was the Secretary of the Treasury. And in March of 2008, he had written a report called the Blueprint for a New Financial Regulation. And it was really odd because in March of 2008, Bear Stearns was going under. All the investment banks and most of the banks had suffered dramatic losses in the quarters before that. And most of the banks were really out looking for more capital and liquidity. And there was really a lot of problems because most of the banks had huge losses that quarter. And so in the middle of all of these huge losses and search for liquidity, the Treasury Department put out this report that says, everything's fine. We have a real strong system that works really well. They didn't measure anything. They didn't say anything about Bear Stearns. They didn't say anything about the collapsing investment banks or the collapsing housing market. The only recommendation that they really had in the report is they wanted to eliminate the thrift industry within 2 years. And so that's kind of Paulson's plan. He wanted to get all those banks, moved into Wall Street. The second part of the Bermuda Triangle is the FDIC. And after the IndyMac failure, the FDIC chair, Sheila Bair, was completely terrified about losing money in her deposit fund. And so she would have done anything to get any of the banks out of the way because she was worried about her deposit fund, which is kind of odd because the FDIC obviously has to protect their deposit fund, but they also had the ability to do a systemic risk exception and be able to loan money to banks whenever there was a systemic risk to the entire system. And we've never had a worse systemic risk than we had in September 2008. So the FDIC did not need to seize and sell all these banks. They could have done the systemic risk exception and provided the same liquidity that they did to Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs.
That's great. So you really had that combination, and then you also had J.P. Morgan Chase.
Yes, the third part of the triangle is J.P. Morgan Chase, who made it known publicly that they really wanted Washington Mutual. One of the myths about the financial crisis is that in the spring of 2008, that J.P. Morgan offered $8 a share for Washington Mutual, and that Washington Mutual turned it down. J.P. Morgan Chase did not ever offer $8 a share. What they did offer in March of 2008 is a non-binding indication of interest that would have required the bank to have dismissed any other suitors and not talk to anybody else and just sort of negotiated with them. And nobody's going to take kind of deal like that. Nobody would want a deal like that. So the two investment banks that were advising Washington Mutual was Lehman Brothers and Goldman Sachs, and they both gave a verified written opinion to reject the J.P. Morgan Chase non-binding indication of interest and accept the much better offer from TPG.
So as you're looking in that period, which of the banks were best positioned and which were having the largest loan losses? Who were really the troubled banks?
People really don't know this, but Bloomberg News did an assessment in July of 2008. and of all the loan losses from all the major banks. And the 4 banks, so they had a list of 20 banks in July of 2008 with the worst mortgage loan losses. And they were Citigroup, UBS, which is a Swiss bank, Merrill Lynch, and HSBC, which is a British bank. Those 4 banks out of the 20 banks that had the most mortgage loan losses, they had half. Just those 4 banks had half of all the loan losses. And Merrill Lynch and Citigroup really had some of the worst losses and the worst performing loans.
You'd mentioned earlier that Washington Mutual had taken some defensive measures in concerns about housing prices becoming a little too inflated, and maybe they should reduce some of the lending. What all kind of went on during that period? You remember with the reduction in the loan originations and getting out of the subprime business and those kind of things.
Yes. So like I mentioned before, Washington Mutual dramatically decreased mortgage lending from 2003 to 2007, and also dramatically reduced subprime lending because it was so difficult to do subprime lending. The subprime unit of Washington Mutual did not originate subprime loans. That's a myth. What they did was they bought, like all the other companies that bank had, all the banks had subprime units, and they all went to the unregulated mortgage brokers to buy these loans. And it was so erratic to try to get a lot of the mortgage brokers to abide by the high standards that Washington Mutual set for their loans. During this entire period from 2003 to 2007, and we've documented this in the book, Washington Mutual continued to increase their FICO scores dramatically, and also, it require a lot more equity on every loan. So at least it was an average of a 70% loan to value ratios, which implies the average loan had more than 30% equity in the loans.
So the loan quality of Washington Mutual and the risk management programs, your research indicated they were in pretty good shape?
Every data piece we've been able to find, and we've got all the original data from all the regulators, is that in the summer and in September of 2008, the industry had a very high 3% mortgage loan losses, whereas Washington Mutual was 1% or less than 1%. So Washington Mutual's loan losses were by far substantially less than the industry.
Okay. Let's shift gears a little bit, and I'll let Linda ask me a few questions. I'll start off talking about maybe the causes of the 2008 financial crisis, and just try to get some level playing field there. I think what happened is the Federal Reserve had interest rates so low in the early 2000s that it caused housing price and made affordability of housing very good, and people started bidding up the prices of housing to what we thought was a bubble status. So you had housing prices rising too quickly, and as we noted, we were quite concerned about that and took these defensive actions to try to get prepared for a potential housing downturn. But what happened is when the housing downturn started to really hit, then the Federal Reserve, instead of providing adequate liquidity and trying to help us get through it, they withheld the liquidity, and it caused the capital markets to freeze and caused housing prices just to start plummeting. And before they knew it, they had a runaway freight train. They didn't know how to manage too much. And so we feel very strongly that we were due for a housing correction. That should have happened. But instead of managing that in a smart way, they made some policy mistakes and just took us down into a downward spiral. And one of the questions that always comes out is, well, with these kinds of problems, who's to blame for all this? And, I guess what we saw coming out of that is everybody wanted to point a finger somewhere else. So the politicians got out very quickly trying to blame anybody but themselves. The Fed got out there and tried to blame everybody but themselves. Wall Street tried to blame others. But the reality is that if something that multiple parties had a role to play in this and help cause it, and I think everyone should be held accountable. From the government standpoint, the Congress and the executive branch, the presidents, were demanding too much lending to low and moderate income families because they wanted to get increased home ownership, but they put so much pressure on their own, we call them government sponsored enterprises, that's Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, to buy more and more subprime loans that they got involved in, and they did too much. Wall Street was clearly to blame because they kept buying a bunch of very poor quality subprime loans and packaging them into securities, putting them all over the world. The rating agencies missed it. They badly underestimated the loan losses that would likely be coming out of any kind of a housing downturn. The underwriting standards early in that decade for loans got too loose, and it was led by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and Wall Street because they were buying most of the loans at the time, but they certainly had a big role to play. And then a lot of the banks followed that loosening of underwriting, and so that they certainly share some of the blame. And anyway, we can just go all the way through. I kind of came up with that. There's really 10 or 11 different parties that all share blame on this, and it's too simple to just point a finger at and say if it wasn't just for this one thing that everything would have worked out okay. I think the party that I want to spend a little extra time on, though, of concern, because I think they might be repeating the same mistake again, is the Federal Reserve. And as you all know, the Federal Reserve sets policies as to how much money we're going to put into the system, what interest rates are going to be, and what kind of guarantees that they as an institution are going to do in backstopping some of these assets. And in the early 2000s, the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates way too much. And they brought the rate of the borrowing rates below the rate of inflation. And whenever that happens, people respond by bidding up the prices of assets and taking on too much debt. And that's kind of what led to the last bubble in housing. And it's what we need to be concerned again about what may be happening today. So let me transition right into that about talking about some of the asset bubbles that we see taking place again today. You know, back in the last financial crisis, housing was really the only major asset category to get too highly priced and to be vulnerable. And you all saw what happened when that bubble corrected, and it led to a severe economic downturn and in that case, a financial crisis. This time, the Federal Reserve has kept interest rates below the rate of inflation for several years now, and that's leading to mass asset bubbles. That's why the stock market is growing so rapidly and is now into speculative territory that is not supported by underlying earnings. That's why housing, I mean, those of us in Seattle, we've seen what's happening to the price of housing. Well, a fair bit of the cause of that is that interest rates are so low, it's made housing affordable for the short run, but people have gone out and bid up the price of that housing. So the price of housing has been growing much, much faster than the underlying rate of inflation. And again, whenever that happens, you've got to ask, are we creating bubble conditions? And then if we kind of go to some other assets about what's happening to collectibles, and we, in many cases, art and things like that have been growing at an even faster pace than what stock prices have. And if you follow CNBC or some of the activities going on in the financial markets today, you're hearing all kinds of new speculative products like special purpose acquisition companies or SPACs, or you've seen what's gone on in Bitcoin, in cryptocurrencies. And now there's new
non-fungibles.
non-fungible tokens. And we're seeing more and more asset categories that are just ballooning in prices because there's so much money chasing a limited number of assets. Now, all of us would love for that to go on forever, wouldn't we? I mean, who's going to object to having something always go up in price? But history tells us that whenever you go through these periods of rapid increases in prices, you're setting yourself up for a potential bursting of those bubbles. And it's that bursting of a bubble that we're most concerned about at this point. And so one of the calls to action we have in our book is for the Federal Reserve to take responsibility. They are causing these asset bubbles, but they are not saying they're responsible or going to manage them. And if the Federal Reserve doesn't take responsibility, who is responsible? And if nobody's responsible, then we have to worry about, are we just setting ourselves up for a potential piercing of those bubbles? And the other thing that happens when interest rates are held at such low levels for extended periods of time is people and governments and businesses go out and borrow heavily because it's so easy to borrow. There's tons of cash everywhere. The interest rates are very low. And as a result of that, corporations are taking on more debt than they have ever taken on in history in relation to the GDP of the country in terms of just the massive amount of debt. The federal government has followed suit. It's been incurring these ongoing huge budget deficits, and they've just been going out and borrowing up a storm to where we now have $28 trillion of federal debt outstanding. We're seeing individuals, student lending is up to about $1.7 trillion now. And for student debt, we're seeing auto loans and particularly subprime auto loans are starting to pick up a lot of steam again. So we kind of worry that we are building both some asset bubbles, but also debt bubbles that need to be carefully unwound through here. So that's a fair bit of what we're trying to encourage from a policy side, is not to just sit back kind of fat, dumb, and happy, but to take some proactive actions to get some of these under control. And so, as I mentioned, the Federal Reserve, we believe, should start gradually taking some of the excess liquidity out of the system, should gradually let interest rates start to return to more normal levels relative to the rate of inflation, and that they should stop buying so many assets themselves. They have about $7.5 trillion of assets they've been buying. And whenever they do that, they bid up the price on those assets too. And that's causing some distortions out there.
So can't the Fed continue to print money forever? And how does that impact the average American family?
Yeah, that's a great question. The Federal Reserve literally prints money out of thin air.
Yes.
There is no gold standard behind it. There's no legal requirement about what they do. They just print it as the way they want. And in the last 5 years, even though the rate of inflation's only been about 11% in total over that period, they have increased our money supply by over 50%. They're just flooding. They're just creating it out of thin air. And in the short run, what that does is drive these asset prices up because so much money is out there chasing stuff. But in the long run, you run that risk of bubbles. And the second is that it almost always leads to much higher levels of inflation. Now, right now, the Federal Reserve keeps saying that they're not worried about inflation, but
I think we all feel the inflation.
Yeah, I mean,
if we go to the grocery store,
go to the grocery store,
Yeah.
see what's happening to your property taxes, see what's happening to your housing prices you're trying to do, and tell me there's no inflation. And I'm going, no way. And even in the last year, things like price of corn is up like 30 or 40%. The price of oil is starting to go back up. A lot of commodities, look what's happening to copper or lumber prices. These have all had very, very substantial price increases. So I think inflation's for real, and I think it's something we need to be very concerned about.
And when these bubbles break, it really impacts the average American family more than Wall Street. A lot of the benefit of these bubbles go to people that can afford to buy these speculative instruments. So they have a lot of advantages, but the average American family usually loses out. One of the charts that we have in the book is called a Gini index, which is an index of income inequality. And every time there's a crash like there was in 2008, it impacts the majority of average American families. So now the income inequality index is just about as high as it was in 1928 before the 1929 crash.
Yeah, one of the concerns again is that in our country we are shrinking the middle class. And what made our country great for decades and decades was this very strong, vibrant middle class. And what's happening is these policies that the Federal Reserve and the others are doing is leading to huge gains for the top 10%, and particularly the top 1% and the top 1/10 of 1%. They are getting disproportionate benefits. And yet the bottom 50% of households in our country control less than 2% of the net worth of households. So the mass middle class is not benefiting proportionally at all. And so as we think about changes for the future, I think not only do we need to get our arms around these budget deficits that the country is running and get our fiscal house back in order, but we've got to keep addressing what are we going to do to help create the middle class? What are we going to do to take away some of this income and net worth inequality that is so pervasive throughout our country at this point? And one comment I'll just make about those federal budget deficits. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic that we had to deal with, we were already running a $1 trillion per year budget deficit and just going out and borrowing and adding it to it. So now we've loaded up all of our kids and grandkids with huge amounts of debt that they're going to have to be responsible for at some point into the future. And if we keep adding $1 trillion a year to the deficits, and then with COVID-19 relief, that'll increase to $2 to $3 trillion for a couple of years.
That was necessary, but now we have to be more careful.
Yeah, I think the evidence is starting to come in that we are coming back from the COVID lockdown problems. The economy does look like it's going to have good growth the rest of this year and into next year. And we think it's that the federal government has got to start shifting away from incurring these same levels of huge deficits and start to get our financial house back in order.
Well, I think we've done about our 45 minutes. And so we'd like to open it up to questions from the audience.
Yeah. So we'll give you a chance to.
There she is again.
Hello, I'm back. So it looks like our audience is being sort of shy, so no pressure, everyone. But if you do have questions, now is the time. Throw those in the Q&A. In the meantime, I have a question. So what would you say what would an individual do to start taking action in these to kind of confront these issues?
That's a great question. That's on everybody's mind.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Ellie, I think first, I don't think this is a great time to go out and try to get rich on speculative investments. If anything, as we've indicated, we think that risks are relatively high right now. And I worry about all the people getting kind of, I'm going to say, sucked into getting more and more into some of these speculative investments at what appear to be fairly high prices. And I think many of those will not end well for people. And so I usually advise people that, have diversified portfolios, be sure that, you're not putting all your eggs in one basket. And this is the time not to go out and try to take substantial risk. I do think on the other side, this has been an excellent period to lock in borrowing costs, like on if somebody has a mortgage or if they have a house, and it's been an excellent time to take out a 30-year fixed rate mortgage and lock in relatively low interest rates for an extended period of time. So I certainly support people doing that. But I think from a political and standpoint and encouragement to our leaders, I think it should be that let's work hard on getting some of this income and net worth inequality improved in the country. Let's work hard on getting our fiscal financial position in a stronger position for the country and start reducing some of these budget deficits.
Thank you. Thank you for answering that. So if I can have a shift a little bit, and if I can just ask you about the research process for this book, what did that look like, and how long did it take? To give me the inside scoop on what writing this book was like.
Well, we've been working on this about 6-7 years. And so we have talked to hundreds of people that were impacted by the crisis. And we have done a lot of research on economic research about what the economists think have caused the financial crisis and what the recommendations are. For example, one of the research things that we have found is that in fact, the Bureau of Economic Research said that there's a direct link between the amount of money that flows into Congress each year and who is saved in a financial crisis. So coincidentally, all the big banks that were saved were also the banks that had spent the most on lobbying funds. And then there's also, we have literally hundreds of thousands of documents from Washington Mutual, emails and reports that we can reference. And we, hundreds of magazine articles and newspaper articles. And I studied financial crises in the past. So there's some research that we did on the crisis of 1929 and then 2008 and also in the 1980s. And there's very similar components in all these crises that we notice. There's somewhat of a shadow banking function that's unregulated and kind of goes out of control. It creates bubbles that burst. And, just a lot of other commonalities that we need to watch out for.
Yeah, I would just say that Linda literally has spent years on doing the research. She had access to information that nobody else has had. Again, just because of information we had, particularly relating to Washington Mutual and the firsthand knowledge of those kinds of things. But I don't think anybody has researched the 2008 financial crisis more than what she has in terms of every available document and every reading that she could possibly do. And again, we just thought it was important to try to get as much of that information out as we could, because we saw that there's been a lot of misinformation and we want to get the facts kind of on the table so people could make more intelligent decisions. And then very importantly, I became increasingly involved in this project when I started seeing how many policy mistakes the Federal Reserve and the government appear to be making again. And so the idea that maybe if we get this information out, we can learn from that and somehow try to avoid the next financial crisis, because we all know how painful that was. It impacted millions of people in a very negative way in this country. And anything we can do to try to avoid that is, I think, very important for us.
Yeah, the financial crisis did not have to happen. If the regulators had planned for this and allowed more liquidity to all the other banks, the crisis could have been prevented.
Mm-hmm. So if there's one sign to look out for, one like thing on the horizon that we should watch out for to kind of see where this is going, what would you say that would be?
Well, I think uh, the red flag for us is whenever you have asset prices rising too fast or much faster than any estimate of an intrinsic value for something, we just have to be really careful. And again, if you just see day after day after day that stock prices are hitting record highs, and you start to see that margin debt, the people borrowing to buy stocks, is at a record level now. And when you see the media reports saying how cool it is for increasing people to get involved in speculative trading, or some of the newer investments that are going through the roof, again, I'm certainly supportive of people making money on investment. Those are all good things. But when that happens across the board in an uncontrolled way, that usually means that that risks are rising, and we all need to be really careful. Again, I'm concerned for most people when I see housing prices rise much more quickly than the rate of inflation. And we're just getting into bidding wars in many communities, or multiple offers. And in some communities now, the majority of buyers are not people living in the homes. It's people out just speculating. And many of them are just institutional pension plans, and foreign buyers and others are coming into market after market and bidding up prices of housing. And when that happens, again, we have to step back and saying, is that creating a risk? And what's it going to do to affordability of housing? What's it going to do to people, people's ability to buy homes for the first time? And those are some of those warning signs that I just see going on right now that I hope the policymakers spend more and more time trying to analyze.
It's a little chilling.
We're basically optimists here, but
hey, realistic is good too.
So here, but but when I see risks rising, I just want them in front of us. That's our best to manage it. We just can't afford to stick our head in the sand and hope things just that problems don't come.
Not all the book is a buzzkill. It's a lot of interesting stories that people find really interesting. A lot of background stuff people don't know. It can be interesting.
I don't think there's anything negative about being proactive. So you were talking earlier a little bit about shrinking the growing the middle class and shrinking the pay discrepancy between the the upper 10%, upper 1%. In your vision, this might be an incredibly difficult question to answer, but in your vision, what is a good way to go about doing that?
Well, I think it's really good to have a solid, steady economic growth that is not being inflated or to the plus side or hurt by these bubbles. And again, my primary concern about these asset bubbles growing is that I don't want us to have to go through a deflation of those that hurts the economy like they did in 2008. So the best thing for our people, all people, long-term, is to have the economy grow at a steady 2 or 3% a year. The other things that I think in our society we have to keep doing is address issues about what's appropriate minimum wage. I think we can afford to have an increasing amount of minimum wage. And I think there's kind of a floor that as a society, we ought to say everybody ought to kind of be there. I think I'd rather see it with minimum wage than I would with just more government welfare programs. Because I think we have to keep the encouragement of most people to work and to work hard and the like, but be sure that they can earn very good wages.
Mhm.
And so I think the measures that are going on there around the country, I think make a lot of sense.
And we're hoping that the new infrastructure proposals that Congress is talking about now will really provide good jobs to people.
Mhm.
And the infrastructure project should be something that really add to the economic growth of a community and something that adds good jobs.
And I think all the data suggests to help all of as many people as possible to earn higher income over their lifetime, that continuing education is an underlying key to that. We know that people with a college degree on average will earn about 50% more over their lifetime than people without a college degree. And maybe it doesn't have to always be a college degree, but something that really as a national priority, that we're going to keep educating our people to the highest level possible makes a lot of sense. And I think that with the advent of all the improvements we have in technology and the ability to do things with that technology, that we ought to be able to bring the cost of education to be more affordable to more and more people.
Yes, that's very important.
Hear, hear. So Tim says, it has a question here in chat. Should the large companies pay their employees more so the federal government doesn't have to subsidize workers getting on government assistance when their employers should foot the bill, i.e. Amazon, Walmart, etc.?
Well, as I alluded to earlier, I agree with that.
Yeah.
I think that government programs are are very difficult to be done effectively over the long run, and they create a lot of unintended consequences the more the government does it. I would far rather see that it get done in the private enterprise, that it happens with normal jobs, that and that we just find a way to keep increasing, be it through the vehicle of a minimum wage, or be it through that our employees can add as much value as possible, and that some of that is education and training and the like, and make it so that the corporations can afford to pay a lot more. I think that's a
Yes.
much better outcome than just more government subsidies.
Well, thank you so much for answering these. Oh, here we go. One more question. Should large companies build affordable housing for their employees? That's interesting.
Well, I think certainly I think that trying to help our employees afford housing is a good thing. I think that doing it with as high a wages as possible makes a lot of sense. I think it becomes increasingly difficult for employers who are not involved in the housing business to effectively build housing and try to provide that directly. But I think that whatever we can do to help people afford housing makes a lot of sense. But getting specifically into building of housing, I think, is something that's probably left to those that are involved in that business.
But companies could help make that happen.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So we are coming to the end of our evening now, but I have one more question. Is there, what are you guys working on next? Basically, is there something on the horizon that we should keep an eye on? new, interesting.
I don't know about Kerry, but I want to write more books. It's been a great experience. I've really enjoyed it. So I'm going to be doing more books.
Wonderful.
We're very busy with our companies. We are involved in trying to help a lot of smaller companies grow and to try to be successful in what they're doing. We also are very involved in our community with our foundation. We have a website on our foundation. You might want to take a look at all the projects we're working on to try to help the communities as well. And on that note, any proceeds that we might get from the sale of these books is all going into our foundation to help the community. We wanted to get this information out, and we think that it can be helpful to our future. Is our goal. From a financial side, again, we will put anything we might get from this back into helping our
And
communities.
our priorities are racial justice, social justice at this point in time are pretty important.
I just threw a link in chat. So folks who are interested in looking into that, go and click the link. It'll take you right over there.
Okay, thank you.
So with that, I believe we're at about at 8 o'clock. So at this point, I just want to say thank you both so much for this discussion. I learned a lot. I'm sure that our attendees learned a lot. Attendees, thank you so much for being here. Come on in, tweet us, let us know what you thought. And of course, as always, go buy some books.
Thanks, Allie.
We really
Thank
appreciate
you.
your help. And thanks
Thank
everyone
you
for
both
joining
So
tonight.
much.
Have a wonderful evening, everyone. And with that, I say good night.
Good night.
Night.
Thank you.